God gives Abraham a vision of the future, and we have to ask why. When you study the Bible, there are certain things you really need to learn how to recognize. I'm about to share the key insights and revelations that God has shown me after studying Genesis chapter 15 for the last 10 years. Hopefully, this will teach you how to read the Bible on a deeper level. Genesis 15 verse 1 starts off by saying, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great." And I think God here being the shield is part of Abraham's reward, or Abram's reward. Just to summarize, God meets Abram in his discouragement, makes a covenant with Abram, and God promises Abram land, descendants, and a future. Abram believes God and is counted righteous, and God shows Abram what must happen before his descendants will eventually possess the promised land. So here in verse 1, there are these previous events that have already transpired. Go read chapter 14 and watch our study on Genesis 14 for further clarity on that. So a question I have just about what has transpired, it says, after these things. I wonder if these previous events were prerequisites for God to bring this word that he brings to Abram here. And now Abram gets to hear what it is that God intends to show him for his future. And I wonder, would God have brought this word no matter what transpired beforehand? Or was this interaction God has with Abram somehow conditioned upon what Abram has already done? Also, it says that God appears, or the word of the Lord appears to Abram in a vision, or comes to Abram in a vision. I wonder, did Abram merely see the messages that he was hearing from God? Was this a visual experience? Or is God visibly showing up to Abram to deliver his message to him in what is called the word of the Lord? In other words, is the word of the Lord merely what is being conveyed in a vision, in a visual manner? Or is the word of the Lord an active agent, a personal being that's actually declaring the message of God to Abram? In other words, is the word of the Lord distinct from the message that God brings? Could the word of the Lord be a personal, active agent in this delivery? And if this vision is merely another way God delivers his message, then what exactly is Abram seeing? The scripture doesn't explicitly say what he's seeing. It just says what Abram is hearing and the message that's being delivered to his ears. So another question I have, and this is what I want to do. I want to teach you how to read the Bible, and part of that involves learning how to ask the right questions. So I hope that this doesn't frustrate some of you as you go, why are we asking questions that seem to have no real answer, or seem to have no real influence on how we interpret the text? If it doesn't really matter, why ask these things? Number one, I think they matter. I think they're significant, and I think they help us meditate on the scriptures on a deeper level. There are layers to meaning when it comes to the truth of God's word conveyed through the written word, or the message behind these words. So a question I have is, why do we have no record of God coming to Abram yet in a vision? Why is this a new experience? Why does God choose to interact with Abram in this new way right now, considering what has just transpired? You know, Abram just won a battle against some pagan kings, rescued his nephew Lot, came to Melchizedek, this mysterious priest king, and gave him a tenth of the spoils. And Melchizedek blesses Abram. And now, after all these things, why is it that God chooses to appear to Abram or interact with Abram in this new way that has not yet been seen? And God says to fear not. He says, "Fear not, Abram," assuming that Abram is afraid of something, or dealing with some kind of frustration or fear or worry on some level. And a question I have is, what kind of fear is God moving Abram away from? And then when God says, "I am your shield," related to the fear, why does God specifically say that he's a shield for Abram? What kind of protection does Abram need? And what does he need protection from now at this point in his life? Is it surrounding national threats and Gentile nations? Is it something? Is it the fear that Abram's dealing with? It seems as though God promises to be Abram's shield, because a question I have is, in what way is God Abram's shield? Part of that seems to involve God defending Abram from whatever he's tempted to be afraid of. God is a shield for Abram in the midst of whatever fears are transpiring around him. And remember, God has just helped Abram win a battle against some pagan kings, and God has already proven to be his shield by defending his life. And then he says, "Your reward shall be very great," as if what's on the mind of Abram is a reward. So God assures Abram that he'll receive a great reward. And I wonder, why does God do this right now? Maybe it's because Abram just worked for no personal gain. He rescued Lot. He helped a bunch of nations and kings fight against other kings, and he got nothing from it except Melchizedek declaring a blessing. So if we consider what just happened, Abram stepping in and playing the role of this sacrificial, warrior, laying down his life, going to help his nephew, and then he chooses to give whatever reward he could have taken. He gives that reward to his allies. And we know that whatever Abram is concerned with, it's clearly spelled out in the next verse, as we'll see in verse 2. God says, Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me? Right? This reward, you being my shield, I continue childless. So Abram seems to be concerned with lacking an heir, lacking offspring, physical descendants. He's childless. That's his main concern. So remember, Abram chose to let his nephew Lot go back to Sodom. And possibly, as we've looked at the narrative so far in our Genesis studies, Abram could have likely viewed Lot as a way for Abram to secure his own future. Lot was his closest relative and could have been a surrogate progenitor for Abram's offspring. In other words, Lot could have been the means by which Abram attained an offspring for himself, whether that was giving his wife Sarah to Lot or Lot being his closest relative through that. However that worked, it seems as though Abram is wrestling with whether or not he'll receive any reward from his continued faithfulness to God. I keep being faithful, and you keep telling me you're going to give me something, and I don't see it. And God assures Abram his reward will be very great. Another reasonable translation is that God is saying he is Abram's great reward, and that's consistent with the rest of Scripture. He's Abram's shield, so it makes sense that he's not just Abram's defense, but his treasure. And even while Abram remains childless, he has what he needs in God and in his promises. And we see a very similar statement made to Abram in Genesis 22, when God tells Abram twice that he's going to have offspring and blessing. Right after he's about to lay down Isaac on the altar, God goes, because you've done this and obeyed my voice and done what I've said, I'm going to bless you and your offspring. So it seems as though the reward is for Abram taking refuge in God as his shield by trusting in God and his words. In other words, how does Abram practically come under God's defense and hide behind him as his shield? Well, by trusting in his word and doing what God says. So there seems to be a connection to God shielding his people and God rewarding his people who actually confide in him as their refuge. And possibly the reward is at least this guaranteed protection to a degree. And then Abram's wrestling with continuing to be childless. It seems like this has been a lasting disappointment for Abram that he can't quite shake. No matter what he does, no matter what success he sees, the elephant in the room, metaphorically speaking, the thorn in his side, is barrenness. Abram has no heir, no child. The fact that he continues childless means God has not changed that. God has not come through on what he promised yet. Abram's focus is on his barrenness, or his wife's barrenness, and they're lacking a child, rather than what God has spoken and promised. So a question I have is, for Abram, in his mind, was Lot ever a realistic option for offspring? And now that Lot has been sent back to Sodom and Abram's kind of sacrificed that and let that go, and he's gone now, is Abram even deeper into this pit that he doesn't see any way out of? He says, the heir of my house is, who is it? Eliezer of Damascus. Verse 2 lets us know, and this is a question I have. When places and people are explicitly named, why are we told where Eliezer comes from? Obviously, he's a stranger in Abram's household. Somehow Abram acquired or gained Eliezer. He's not a part of Abram's immediate family, bloodline. So Abram's wrestling with this guy that I have acquired somehow is going to be the heir of my estate. And the only time Damascus has been referenced in Genesis so far is in the previous chapter. The only time in Genesis Damascus is mentioned is in the previous chapter where Abram and his allies pursue the pagan kings north of Damascus. And so a question I have is, number one, why is Damascus brought up? Why do we need to know where Eliezer comes from? Why is it not enough to just say a servant is going to be my heir? And that's frustrating. What about Eliezer's background and origin connects to Abram's victory in the previous chapter, if there is a connection? And Damascus throughout the biblical narrative is going to be associated with Syria, one of Israel's biggest enemies. That's the capital of Syria. So historically speaking, Damascus is connected to Syria. So maybe a question we should ask is, what about this chapter or story connects back to Syria, one of the key enemies of Israel later on? Verse 3, and Abram said, behold, you've given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And God responds, the word of the Lord comes to him, this man shall not be your heir. Just so you know, I'm letting you know now, this is not going to be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. So God corrects Abram's assumptions very quickly. And the word of the Lord comes. Verse 5, he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven, number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be, as numerous as the stars. So for some reason, the stars in the sky are a point of reference for how many descendants Abram is going to have. We're told twice that the word of the Lord has come to Abram. The first time was with the message, right? The second time was to effectively do something to Abram. In other words, a question we should ask is, who is the one bringing Abram outside? Because no other character has been listed in the text except the word of the Lord, as if to be this active personal agent in delivering the message of God. So who's the one bringing Abram outside? It seems most likely that the word of the Lord comes, appears, and brings Abram outside, as if, again, to have an active role in what's happening. Then when God says, count the stars, this is similar to Genesis chapter 13 when he promises to make Abram's descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. Now it's the stars of the heavens. So it's not just on an earthly level now, it's on a cosmic level. Kind of how Joseph has one dream about the wheat of the earth that represent him and his family, and then he has a cosmic dream about the stars representing him and his family. And then Daniel, later on in at the end of the Old Testament, Daniel will see the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days as the glorified cosmic king of all creation. So I wonder if there's any connection to that, why the stars are referenced. Hey, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you on our website at abovereproachministry.com. Maybe you want to learn how to study the Bible. We have free Bible classes just for you. Are you maybe a newer believer? Go ahead and check out our Christianity 101 Foundations course. Maybe you hate videos. Well, we have a podcast, so you can listen to all of our messages on whatever podcast platform you prefer. Maybe you want to join or start a discussion group. Check out our map of all the current armed discussion groups all around the world. And do you maybe live near Greenville, South Carolina? If you do, you should check out our church on Friday nights. Visit movementchurchsc.com for more information. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, or head over to the donate page and donate through debit or credit card, PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or even mail a check to P.O. Box 509, Inman, South Carolina. And if you want to make a ministry connection, feel free to reach out to me on our website. All right, I know that was a lot, but I'm done. So let's get back to the video. And he says, so shall your offspring be. Abram's offspring will include kings, and God will justify those of faith just as he did for Abraham, as well as Genesis 17:5 tells us he'll be the father of many nations. Verse 6 says, he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. A big glaring question I have is why? Abram believed in hope against hope, as Romans tells us. A word from God is all Abram needed, and it's all we need to have faith too. But why does God wait until this particular moment to make Abram righteous? Why does he credit Abram now instead of earlier? Abram has demonstrated faith time and time again already by doing all these different things, and he'll continue demonstrating faith. Not perfectly, but he's a roller coaster ride just like humanity is. What makes this particular moment in Genesis 15 the moment that is special compared to the others where God gives him righteousness? Why this moment? Of all the moments Abram has believed God, taken him at his word, why now? And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Verse 7, this is almost verbatim what God continues to tell Israel. Once he rescues them out of Egypt, he continues to use Egypt as a reference point to say, I've been faithful, I rescued you. And God will speak of bringing Abram out of the land of Chaldeans, which is Babylon. So here God takes the father of the faith out of Babylon, and eventually down the line, God will pull Abram's descendants out of the Babylonian exile into the promised land the way he did at the Exodus. So God has a reputation of pulling people out of slavery and the place of darkness and paganism. So this brings us back to how God is Abram's shield in verse 1. God brought him out. God protected him. God ensured his promise to Abram, as if God personally guards those promises and guards Abram. So this whole chapter is about God protecting, God accomplishing, God fulfilling, God doing the heavy lifting. And you should sense gospel all over this. God giving Abram a son and fulfilling his promise is related to God bringing him out of Babylon. So he says, look, I brought you out, and I'm going to give you this land. So I brought you out of one place, I'm going to give you a new place. And in between are the descendants of Abram to possess that land eventually. So Abram can't practically possess land without descendants. He needs an heir. Verse 8, he says, oh, Lord God, how am I to know that I'm going to possess it? Abram's still doubting, right? This is a solid question, though, because how can he know if he's already dead before it's going to happen? God's saying, your descendants will possess, but Abram's going, how will I know that's happened if I'll be dead? So this seems to indicate also some doubt on the part of Abram. But verse 6, we already saw Abram believe the Lord already, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So how do we make sense of that apparent conflict? Abram doesn't seem sure he's going to have descendants that possess the land yet. Now verse 9, it gets really interesting. Very interesting indeed. He says to Abram, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. We should ask, why these animals? Why 3 years old? Abram brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against each other. But he didn't cut the birds in half. In other words, Abram knew what to do. So I have a question. How did Abram know what to do with the animals? God never said what to do. He said what to bring. And it's very likely this was a common cultural custom known as either a suzerain vassal treaty, in which a dominant entity ensured the safety and protection of a lesser party, or Abram at least knows how to cut a covenant. In other words, cutting a covenant, that's a cultural custom of his day in the ancient East, where this was a symbolic act of walking between two halves of dead animals to seal a covenant between two parties. What's interesting, though, is we're going to see that God is the only one who walks between these two halves. He guarantees the covenant. Abram does nothing to add to this treaty or have some responsibility in upholding his end. He doesn't necessarily have a side or responsibility to play in this covenant. God makes a covenant with him. Abram is a beneficiary, but he's not a party that has to ensure any conditions or meet any parameters. God just guarantees, here's what I'll do, because Abram has already believed and shown faith. So God responds. This is all about what God will do. He walks through. It's not both parties walking through the two halves. You're going to see that it's God. Verse 11, and when birds of prey came down, which again should give you an image of Jesus. Jesus upholds our end of the new covenant. The Father on the other side, it's God on both ends. When birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. That's an interesting detail. Back to verse 10, it says that Abram didn't cut the birds in half. Verse 11, we have birds of prey coming down on the dead carcasses, so maybe there's a connection here. The mention of birds twice might be significant, right? One set of birds is offered to God, while another set of birds is unclean, preying upon dead things. Verse 11, it says, as the sun is going down, which means Abram waited long enough for God to do something, which means so much time has passed that the sun has already gone down and nothing has happened, which seems almost symbolically representative of Abram waiting for a son, waiting for the promises of God to be fulfilled. He's doing everything he's supposed to do. Nothing's happening yet. Nothing's moving forward in a visual kind of way. So just think about the birds. Why did Abram not cut them in half? And why do we have birds of prey coming down? As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. So there's a dark setting to this event that seems to represent the kind of gloomy message Abram is about to receive. He's about to be told some unfortunate news about the future of his descendants. Though there is good news within it, it's also news of slavery and being treated poorly. The great deep sleep, it says a deep sleep fell on Abram. If we think about, hey, have we seen this at all with any other chosen partners God has used. We've seen many chosen partners throughout the Genesis story so far. Two of them are Adam and Noah. And what's interesting about both of those two chosen partners God uses is they both experienced a deep sleep. Adam was put into a deep sleep, and then his wife comes from his rib. And then we see Noah fall into a deep sleep where Ham violates him, and Noah wakes up from his kind of drunken stupor. And though the deep sleep might not be a physical falling asleep, it's at least a kind of, it's an intoxication to a level of being almost unconscious. So there's a great deep sleep that falls on God's covenant partners and chosen individuals. Verse 13, the Lord said to Abram, this is interesting news to bring Abram as he's discouraged and dealing with his frustration. Know for certain your offspring will be sojourners or strangers in a land that is not theirs. They'll be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. 400 years of affliction as foreigners. A question I have is, did God want this to happen? Because you're going to see it seems as though this is the condition that God intends to put Israel in for several centuries in order for the sins of the Amorites to be complete in the Promised Land. So in other words, I have a question, was 400 years of affliction a necessary prerequisite for what God was going to do? Or was 400 years longer than what God ideally wanted for Israel? God promises a 400-year period. He knows there's going to be a kind of silence where the people of Israel are wondering, in affliction for 4 centuries, where's the God of our fathers? And that 400-year period of silence is something that we see between the Old Testament and then Jesus coming on the scene, or John the Baptist in the New Testament, 400 years of silence. Verse 14, I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. It seems as though God intends to answer their affliction with justice, right? That they serve. I lost my place. Afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. So that's great. God promises they'll come out of. He doesn't say Egypt necessarily. That's what's interesting. God doesn't say what nation, but we know it's Egypt. Just as God brought Abram out of Babylon in verse 7, he promises to do a similar thing on a bigger scale for the nation of Israel. So just as Abram got great possessions from his last battle in the last chapter with the Gentile kings, God will give Israel victory and help them plunder their enemies later on. So I have a few questions. Why these details? Why does Abram need to know they're going to have great possessions? Why does Abram need to know God is going to judge the nation? Why does Abram need to know that his descendants will be in affliction for 400 years? Why does Abram need, what's the significance behind that? Is it maybe related to the question about how, back in verse 8, and God's kind of laying out the blueprint? Here's how it's going to happen. Here's how your descendants will acquire the promised land. It seems to be at least part of God's answer to Abram's question and inquiry. And he goes, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. That's great. And you'll be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So many interesting details that we think are unnecessary for Abram to know, but apparently God doesn't think that. God's timetable for Israel involves others being evicted out of the land for their own sin. God's plan for Israel involves waiting for certain things to fall into place with other nations. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, this is where God passes through the dead animal halves to solidify this covenant. He's cutting a covenant. A smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Abram did not. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Abram did not make a covenant. There's nothing for Abram to do. This is all about what God is going to do for Abram and his descendants, and Abram has already demonstrated faith. To your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites. In verse 17, the smoking firepot and the torch, it's as if someone is carrying that smoking firepot and flaming torch. We know that God is honoring the sacrifice that Abram brought, those animals, by passing through and making that covenant. But the fact is, God makes the covenant with Abram. So now Abram knows for sure, with this cutting of the covenant, that God will give him the land. God will give him an heir. God will give descendants. And then we have this mention of the river Euphrates and the other river, I forget what it was. But, I don't know, I have a question. Why are the rivers specifically mentioned as being the boundaries for the land that they will acquire? Might this, in other words, God could have explained the boundaries of Israel in a different way, but he uses the rivers as the boundary markers. And I wonder if this is to bring us back to Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where we see the four rivers being key landmarks of that ancient world that are essentially flowing out of Eden to represent God's blessing upon the world through that one place being Eden. Water flows out, and I wonder if Abram is kind of like that with his descendants. He's going to be a blessing. They'll be a blessing to the nations, and that land will bless the entire world via the Messiah that comes. And then he lists all the different tribes who inhabit the land currently. The Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, all these different ites. This is God giving the land that belongs to someone right now to someone else. This goes all the way back to Abram's doubts, his questions, and his wondering. How can I know I'm going to have land? How can I know I'm going to have descendants? Now he knows how. He knows what God will do. He knows the specific region, and he knows all these other extra details just for fun. So that is Genesis chapter 15. In the next Bible study walkthrough, we will jump into Genesis chapter 16. Hey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more biblical content just like this. We have hundreds of videos, but you might be most interested in these ones right here. Also, visit our website for all of our free resources and classes. And thank you so much for partnering with us financially to make this ministry even possible. Keep moving towards Jesus, and I'll see you in the next video.